June 4, 1942. The Pacific Ocean roars under a rising sun as the Battle of Midway begins, an engagement that will change the course of the Second World War. High above the waves, U.S. Navy aircraft roar toward a Japanese fleet that seems unstoppable. Below, the aircraft carrier USS Yorktown, CV-5, moves steadily through the deep blue, a veteran of Coral Sea, scarred, bruised, but somehow ready for another fight. Her crew stands at battle stations, some with bandaged hands, others barely recovered from exhaustion. None of them truly believe she should even be here. Just weeks earlier, the Yorktown had been left in ruin, bombed, torpedoed, and burning. On May 8, 1942, at the Battle of the Coral Sea, she had absorbed tremendous punishment from Japanese dive bombers. Flames had torn across her decks, communications failed, and water poured into her hull. When she limped back to Pearl Harbor, many believed the proud carrier was finished. But the U.S. Navy couldn't afford to lose her. With only 2 operational carriers left in the Pacific, Enterprise and Hornet, the loss of Yorktown would leave America dangerously exposed. The Japanese fleet, fueled by a string of victories across the Pacific, now aimed to destroy what remained of U.S. naval power. Their next target, Midway Atoll, a small but strategic patch of coral halfway between Asia and America. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, understood what was coming. Through intercepted Japanese communications, U.S. intelligence had already decoded the enemy's plans. They knew when and where Japan would strike, but only if they could get enough carriers to meet them there. So Nimitz made a bold decision. The Yorktown had to be made battle-ready in time, no matter the cost. When she entered Pearl Harbor's Dry Dock No. 1 on May 27th, inspectors estimated she needed at least 90 days of repairs. Her flight deck was riddled with holes, her hull twisted, and entire compartments flooded. But Nimitz gave the shipyard just 3 days. Not a single man in that dockyard believed it was possible. What followed was one of the most extraordinary repair efforts in naval history. Over 1,400 shipyard workers, mechanics, welders, and electricians swarmed the carrier around the clock. Sparks flew through the Hawaiian night as torches and hammers echoed from every deck. Crews worked in overlapping shifts, eating and sleeping beside the ship. Oil-stained uniforms, sunburned faces, and bleeding hands became symbols of determination. The Yorktown wasn't just a ship. It was a message to the enemy that America would not back down. By May 30th, just 72 hours later, the impossible had been done. The USS Yorktown emerged from dry dock battered but seaworthy, her flight deck patched, her engines humming, her air crews rearmed and ready. Sailors looked up at her towering island superstructure with disbelief and pride. Many had watched her burn just days before. Now, she was headed back into the fight. On May 31st, Yorktown sailed out of Pearl Harbor, escorted by destroyers and supply ships. Sailors on nearby vessels cheered her departure, saluting the miracle that had just taken place. She joined Admiral Raymond Spruance's Task Force 16, Enterprise and Hornet, and the newly formed Task Force 17, under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher. Together, these 3 carriers would face the might of the Imperial Japanese Navy at Midway. And as the Yorktown's bow sliced through the Pacific waves, her men knew one thing for certain: their ship had no right to be alive. But she was. And she was about to become the centerpiece of one of the most decisive naval battles in history. By the dawn of June 4, 1942, the Pacific stretched silent and endless, but beneath that calm surface, 2 great fleets were moving toward each other unseen, unstoppable. For Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Imperial Japanese Navy, Midway was to be the final blow that would cripple American resistance once and for all. The plan was complex, elegant, and fatally overconfident. Japan's fleet included 4 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. the same force that had devastated Pearl Harbor just 6 months earlier. They carried more than 250 aircraft and thousands of elite sailors and aviators. Their mission: seize Midway Atoll, draw out what remained of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, and destroy it. But what Yamamoto didn't know was that the Americans were waiting. Thanks to the brilliant work of U.S. Navy cryptanalysts at Station Hypo, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, American intelligence had cracked Japan's naval code, JN-25. They knew that AF, the target mentioned in secret messages, was Midway. They even knew the date of the attack. While the Japanese fleet steamed toward Midway confident of surprise, Admiral Chester Nimitz had already positioned his own forces northeast of the island, hidden beyond the horizon. Waiting there were 3 American carriers: Enterprise, Hornet, and the newly repaired Yorktown, ready to spring an ambush of their own. As the sun climbed over the Pacific that morning, the skies erupted into war. At 4:30 a.m., Japanese aircraft launched their first strike against Midway Island itself. Bombers roared over the tiny atoll, releasing waves of destruction on runways, fuel tanks, and anti-aircraft positions. The Marines stationed there fought back fiercely, filling the air with bursts of flak and tracer fire. Back at sea, Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher aboard Yorktown received the first reports of the attack. There was no hesitation. Orders went out: launch the strike groups. Engines roared to life across the carrier decks as deck crews scrambled to prepare the planes. Pilots tightened their harnesses, gunners loaded belts of ammunition, and torpedo bombers lined up under the rising sun. By mid-morning, American carrier-based planes were searching for the Japanese fleet. The first waves, mostly from Hornet and Enterprise, found the enemy but attacked piecemeal, uncoordinated, and without fighter cover. What followed was a slaughter. Japanese Zero fighters tore through the slow-moving torpedo squadrons, VT-8, VT-6, and VT-3, cutting them apart with withering precision. Out of 41 torpedo bombers launched, only 4 returned. Entire squadrons were wiped out. But their sacrifice was not in vain. The low-flying torpedo planes had drawn the Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level, leaving the sky above open for the next wave of attackers. At 10:22 a.m., American dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown arrived overhead, unseen, unchallenged, and perfectly positioned. In a matter of seconds, they changed the course of the Pacific War. Plunging from 20,000 feet, bombs screamed through the sky, smashing into the flight decks of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. The explosions were apocalyptic. Aviation fuel ignited. Bombs and torpedoes stored below detonated, sending fireballs and shrapnel through entire decks. Within minutes, 3 of Japan's proudest carriers were burning wrecks, their flight decks melting, their crews trapped below. Only Hiryu, the 4th carrier, survived the initial onslaught. Her aircrews retaliated with vengeance. At around noon, a formation of 18 dive bombers from Hiryu spotted the USS Yorktown. From the carrier's deck, lookouts shouted, "Enemy aircraft incoming." Alarms blared. Gunners took their stations. The Yorktown's fighters scrambled into the air to intercept, while the ship's anti-aircraft guns thundered in all directions. The Japanese bombers came in fast and precise. Bombs struck the flight deck in rapid succession, one exploding near the bridge, another tearing through the deck into the hangar bay below. Flames erupted, smoke filled the sky, the ship shook under the impact. But this time the crew was ready. Damage control teams, veterans of Coral Sea, moved instantly. Within minutes, they sealed off the burning sections, extinguished the fires, and patched the ruptured steam lines. Yorktown slowed, then steadied. She was wounded but alive. By early afternoon, Yorktown's flight deck was operational again. Fighters took off, returning to protect the fleet. Her crew had performed another miracle, saving the ship yet again under fire. But the battle wasn't over. A second Japanese strike group was already on its way. By the early afternoon of June 4, 1942, the skies over the Pacific were a chaos of smoke, fire, and roaring engines. USS Yorktown, barely repaired in 72 relentless hours, steamed steadily with Enterprise and Hornet in close formation, ready to strike back. But the Japanese were far from done. From the burning remnants of their carriers, Hiryu launched a devastating second strike. 54 dive bombers aimed directly at Yorktown. The American sailors and pilots knew what was coming. Damage control teams moved frantically, flooding compartments, shoring up bulkheads, and extinguishing fires even as bombs tore through the decks. Explosions rattled the ship from stem to stern. The crew braced for disaster. Planes lifted off as fast as the damaged deck could allow. Pilots like Dick Best and John Waldron knew the stakes. Every aircraft in the sky was a lifeline. Every second mattered. The American dive bombers, having circled and refueled, climbed to striking altitude, aiming for the exposed decks of the Japanese carriers. Meanwhile, Torpedo Squadron 8 had already paid the ultimate price. Flying slow, vulnerable Douglas TBD Devastators without fighter cover, they attacked the Japanese carriers head-on. The scene was apocalyptic. One by one, the planes were shredded by Zero fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Out of 15 pilots, only Ensign George Gay survived, floating in the oil-slicked ocean, watching his comrades burn and sink into the sea. Gay's survival was a cruel twist of fate. The torpedo attack itself, though almost entirely destroyed, had drawn the Japanese fighters to low altitude. That distraction allowed the American dive bombers to arrive from above unchallenged. At 10:22 a.m., Lieutenant Dick Best led Dive Bomber Squadron 6 from Enterprise directly toward Akagi. Pulling over the carrier at 2,500 feet, Best released a 1,000-pound bomb with unerring precision. The impact tore through the flight deck, igniting armed aircraft and fuel stores below. Within minutes, Akagi was engulfed in fire. Simultaneously, Yorktown's dive bombers, led by Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie, struck Soryu, while Enterprise pilots targeted Kaga. The destruction was swift and total. Within 6 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers, the pride of the Imperial Navy, were reduced to burning hulks. Smoke and flames stretched across the horizon like a funeral pyre for Japan's offensive might. From his hiding place in the water, George Gay could only watch in awe and horror. The planes of his fallen comrades had paved the way for this devastation, and their sacrifice had not been in vain. Yet victory came at a steep cost. Hiryu, the surviving Japanese carrier, retaliated with precision. Her aircraft struck USS Yorktown, landing 3 direct hits. Fires erupted on the flight deck and hangars, threatening to sink the ship. Damage control crews worked tirelessly, battling flames and flooding compartments to keep her afloat. The Yorktown's crew, already exhausted from repairs, performed a miracle. For hours, the ship remained afloat, a testament to discipline, courage, and ingenuity. By late afternoon, American forces regrouped. Dive bombers returned to finish the work. Hiryu was discovered and attacked from above. Bomb after bomb tore through her decks, leaving her burning uncontrollably. For the first time in months, the Imperial Japanese Navy's aura of invincibility was broken. As darkness fell, the toll of the Battle of Midway became clear. Japanese losses: 4 aircraft carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, 248 aircraft, and over 3,500 men, including many of their most experienced pilots. American losses: 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, 147 aircraft, and 362 men. The disproportionate casualty count told only part of the story. The strategic victory was complete. Japan's offensive in the Pacific had been shattered. The initiative had passed irrevocably to the Americans. In the aftermath, Admiral Nimitz recognized the full impact of intelligence and bravery. Without the codebreakers at Station Hypo, without the calculated risks of commanders like Spruance and Fletcher, Without the courage of pilots who pressed attacks in near-certain death, Midway would have ended in disaster. George Gay, the lone survivor of VT-8, drifted among the wreckage of his squadron, a living witness to the sacrifices that had made victory possible. The torpedo bombers, near-suicidal attacks had diverted Japanese fighter cover long enough for the dive bombers to strike decisively. Courage, timing, and sacrifice had combined to turn almost certain defeat into stunning triumph. The Battle of Midway was more than a tactical engagement. It was a turning point in world history. For the first time, aircraft carriers, intelligence, and audacious planning had combined to redefine naval warfare. The age of the battleship was over. The Americans had proven that determination, ingenuity, and courage could overcome even the most experienced and confident enemy. As the sun set on June 4, 1942, the tide of the Pacific War had turned. Japan would fight on, but the heart of its offensive power, its carriers and elite pilots, had been destroyed. The United States, battered but unbroken, had seized the initiative. Midway was a testament to intelligence, courage, and sacrifice. It proved that even the smallest island, defended by resolute men and women and supported by brilliant planning, could change the course of a war. The USS Yorktown had survived the fires, bombs, and near-total destruction inflicted by Hiryu's counterstrike, but the battle was not yet over. On June 5th and 6th, the carrier limped under her own power, patched and stabilized by heroic damage control crews. Every rivet, every bulkhead, every pump had been the product of tireless effort and courage under fire. Yet fate was unforgiving. On June 7th, a Japanese submarine, I-168, slipped silently beneath the waves. Her torpedoes struck Yorktown's hull with deadly precision. Explosions tore through the patched sections, and the carrier, battered and exhausted from her previous ordeal, began to list uncontrollably. Smoke poured from the decks as alarms blared. The crew fought valiantly, but they knew their ship could not be saved. Lifeboats were lowered, sailors jumped into the Pacific, and the once-proud carrier slipped beneath the waves, leaving only memories of heroism and sacrifice. Yorktown's loss was tragic, yet it did not overshadow the decisive victory that Midway represented. Across the Pacific, Japanese commanders faced the consequences of overconfidence and miscalculation. 4 of their fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, had been destroyed, along with hundreds of experienced pilots and crews. The offensive capability of the Japanese Navy had been shattered. Their expansion in the Pacific came to a halt. For the Americans, the victory was both strategic and symbolic. The initiative in the Pacific had passed firmly into Allied hands. The United States, still recovering from Pearl Harbor, had demonstrated that intelligence, planning, and courage could overcome numerical and technological disadvantages. Nimitz, in his after-action reports, praised the codebreakers, the planners, and above all, the pilots whose daring and sacrifice had made victory possible. Yet behind the statistics and strategy were the human stories that defined Midway. Torpedo Squadron 8, annihilated in the skies above the Japanese carriers, had achieved the impossible through sheer bravery. George Gay, the lone survivor, carried the memory of his fallen comrades, knowing their deaths had shaped the course of the war. Dick Best, Max Leslie, and the dive bomber crews had struck at the exact moment when Japanese defenses were most vulnerable, turning sacrifice into triumph. Midway also marked a turning point in naval warfare. For the first time, a major fleet engagement had been decided entirely by aircraft. The opposing battleships never came within sight of each other. The aircraft carrier had supplanted the battleship as the dominant instrument of naval power. Intelligence, timing, and courage had become just as decisive as firepower. For Japan, the defeat was catastrophic. Experienced pilots and crews, once the backbone of their offensive capability, were gone. The carriers they had relied upon for rapid expansion were lost, leaving the Japanese Navy on the defensive for the remainder of the war. Even as new ships were commissioned, the combination of skill, experience, and momentum could never be fully restored. For the United States, Midway became a symbol of what could be achieved with ingenuity, preparation, and valor. The Codebreakers at Station Hypo had cracked the Japanese plan, allowing Nimitz and his commanders to position their forces perfectly. The carriers, repaired at miraculous speed and expertly commanded, had struck at the enemy's heart. Pilots, many of them civilians only months before, had risen to the occasion, transforming fear into decisive action. As the smoke cleared over Midway and the last Japanese ships fled into the horizon, a new reality emerged. The Pacific War had changed. America's industrial might, combined with courage and intelligence, would now shape the conflict. The lessons of Midway, intelligence, preparation, courage, and the willingness to take calculated risks would echo through every subsequent engagement in the Pacific. Today, Midway Atoll is quiet, its airstrips abandoned, its bunkers crumbling, its waters calm. Yet beneath the surface lie the memories of the thousands who fought and died there. The legacy of Midway is not just in ships sunk or planes destroyed, but in the demonstration that free peoples, united and determined, can overcome the seemingly impossible. The battle proved that even against a formidable, experienced enemy, preparation, courage, and sacrifice could change history. It was a triumph of strategy over chance, of intelligence over ignorance, of will over fear. And in those waters around a tiny Pacific atoll, the United States Navy had proven its resolve, its ingenuity, and its ability to prevail. The story of Midway is a story of heroes, of sacrifice, and of the enduring power of human courage. From the Codebreakers at Pearl Harbor to the pilots in the skis above the Pacific, from the damage control crews aboard Yorktown to the Marines defending the island, each played a part in turning the tide of war. The Battle of Midway did more than halt Japan's advance. It reshaped the Pacific, shifted the momentum of World War II, and etched into history the lesson that even in the darkest hour, intelligence, courage, and determination can achieve the extraordinary.